Summer 1456. The Sultan known as the Conqueror brings the world's greatest army and thunderous cannons to the gates of a battered city. Inside those crumbling walls, hope is all but gone. A forgotten general rallies a ragtag band of peasants, priests, and mercenaries, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by their king. Outside, 100,000 Ottoman soldiers prepare to erase Belgrade from the map. But when the first cannonballs crash through stone, something extraordinary happens. The defenders refuse to break. Faith clashes with firepower, and desperation turns into defiance. This is not just a siege. This is the moment a handful of heroes stood against an empire and changed the course of history. If you're enjoying this already, smash like, subscribe, and most importantly, give this video a hype. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand just how impossible this victory was, you first have to understand the man marching on Belgrade. This wasn't just any sultan. This was Mehmed II, and just 3 years earlier, in 1453, he had done what no one thought could be done. At only 21 years old, he had conquered Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople represented more than just another military conquest. It marked the end of a 1,000-year empire. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, had withstood countless sieges since its founding in 330 AD. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, had turned back every attack, from Huns to Arabs to Bulgars. These massive fortifications, consisting of an inner wall 40 feet high, backed by a second wall 27 feet high, with a deep moat in front, had been considered impregnable. But Mehmed brought something new to warfare: massive bronze cannons designed by Hungarian engineer Orban. The largest of these monsters, nicknamed Basilica, was 27 feet long, weighed 19 tons, and could fire a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. The sound of its firing could be heard 10 miles away, and its projectiles could shatter through 6 feet of solid stone. The siege of Constantinople lasted 53 days, from April 6th to May 29th, 1453. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, died fighting on the walls as the city fell. His body was never definitively identified among the thousands of corpses, though some claimed to recognize him by the imperial eagles embroidered on his boots. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, its legendary walls turning back dozens of sieges. It was the heart of the old Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, and a bastion of Christendom. Mehmed broke it, and he did it with strategic genius and a terrifying new form of warfare. Massive, powerful cannons that could turn stone walls into dust. With Constantinople's fall, a shockwave of fear shot across Europe. The news reached Venice within days through their efficient courier system, and from there spread to every court in Christendom. Kings canceled tournaments, popes called for crusades, and merchants began moving their wealth inland from vulnerable coastal cities. Mehmed was no longer just a sultan. He was Fatih Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, and his ambition had no limits. He saw himself as the heir to the Roman Caesars, destined to build a new world empire from the city he'd just taken. The young sultan had ambitious plans. He spoke of capturing Rome itself, of making the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake, and of ruling from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But to push west, to march on the capitals of Europe, he first needed to secure his path. And that path ran straight through one critical fortress: Belgrade. Belgrade stood at the meeting of the Danube and Sava rivers, the gateway to Hungary and the plains of Central Europe. Known to the Romans as Singadunum, it had long been a key fortress. Its limestone walls crowned a high plateau, with an upper fortress housing the governor, garrison, and cathedral, and a lower town for civilians and trade. For centuries, it was the last Christian bulwark against the Ottomans, withstanding repeated sieges, including Mehmed's failed assault in 1448. Whoever held Belgrade controlled the Danube, vital trade routes, and the road to Vienna and the Holy Roman Empire. Mehmed understood. To push west, Belgrade had to fall. Mehmed's army was the most modern force of its age, about 60,000 to 70,000 men. At its core stood the Janissaries, elite infantry raised from Christian boys through the devshirme system, trained from childhood in languages, engineering, and weapons, loyal only to the Sultan. Disciplined, professional, and armed with bows, swords, and early firearms, they terrified Europe. Backing them were the Spahi cavalry, land-holding nobles who brought their own armored horsemen. The Ottomans also excelled in logistics, moving with herds, wagons of grain, and a massive artillery train of 300 cannons, including the giant bronze guns that had shattered Constantinople. Their advance north was a spectacle of dust, thunder, and dread. Meanwhile, Hungary was in crisis. King Ladislaus the Posthumous, only 16, was trapped in factional disputes. Nobles quarreled and withheld funds, feudal levies were weak, and the treasury was nearly empty. The kingdom seemed paralyzed, awaiting conquest. Only 2 men resisted despair. John Hunyadi, Transylvanian warlord and veteran of countless victories over the Turks, gathered 10,000 loyal mercenaries and his famed Black Army knights. And John of Capistrano, a fiery 70-year-old Franciscan friar, preached a people's crusade, rallying peasants and common folk to fight. Together, they would meet Mehmed at Belgrade in what would become one of Europe's most decisive battles. An unlikely alliance formed. John Hunyadi, the hardened general funding his own small professional army, and John of Capistrano, the fiery friar who believed faith could raise a host strong enough to stop the Sultan. Their visions clashed. Hunyadi trusted discipline and tactics, while Capistrano preached mass mobilization through faith. Yet each recognized the other's strength. Hunyadi needed numbers, and Capistrano needed military expertise. Together, they became Belgrade's only hope. The People's Crusade. Capistrano's call electrified Hungary. From villages and towns, thousands poured in. Farmers with scythes, blacksmiths with hammers, butchers with cleavers, carpenters with axes. Poor peasants marched beside merchants, German settlers beside Hungarian farmers, even a few nobles inspired by his sermons. They came untrained, unarmored, and armed mostly with farm tools, but burning with conviction. Historians often dismiss such forces as mobs, yet these people made a conscious choice to risk everything. By late June 1456, Hunyadi's 10,000 professionals were joined by 15,000 to 20,000 crusaders. It was still fewer than Mehmed's 70,000, but far more than the nobles had offered. For Hunyadi, the swelling host was both salvation and disaster. He finally had numbers, but they were undisciplined and untested. The general and the priest ruled side by side, a divided command that defied military logic. Hunyadi drilled his knights and mercenaries in tactics and siege defense, while Capistrano turned his camp into a living sermon, priests leading hymns, banners waving, masses held daily. It was an army unlike any Europe had seen. Half disciplined professionals, half an ecstatic crowd, convinced they fought in God's name. And while they lacked armor or training, they carried something else, unyielding faith, which would soon become their deadliest weapon. As Mehmed's army arrived and the siege began in early July 1456, this strange mixed force was all that stood in its way. The Ottoman army's arrival was a spectacle that must have struck terror into the hearts of the defenders. An Ottoman chronicler described their white tents stretching across the plains, like a field of snow that covered the earth from horizon to horizon. The sight was deliberately intimidating. Ottoman armies were as much about psychological warfare, physical combat. The vast camp, with its precise organization and forest of standards, was designed to overwhelm enemies before the fighting even began. Inside the fortress of Belgrade, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihai Szilágyi, commanded a small garrison of only 5,000 to 7,000 men. These were the core defenders, professional soldiers who understood that they were buying time with their lives. The fortress itself was strong, but not impregnable. Its walls had been built for an earlier era of warfare, before the advent of massive siege cannons. Outside the city, camped along the Danube, was this unlikely alliance: Hunyadi's small professional army and Capistrano's enormous, chaotic crusader host. The contrast between the two parts of the Christian force was stark and visible to everyone, including the Ottomans. Together, their total force numbered between 25,000 and 30,000 men. They would have to face the storm together, but how they would coordinate remained an open question. In the first days of July, the Ottoman army arrived with the precision of a military machine perfected through decades of campaigning. The Ottomans had developed siege warfare into a science, with standardized procedures that had proven effective from the walls of Constantinople to the fortresses of Anatolia. The Danube River, the city's lifeline, was choked by an Ottoman fleet of around 200 ships. This fleet was not merely a collection of vessels, but a carefully organized naval force. The larger galleys, some mounting cannons, formed the backbone of the blockade. Smaller vessels, galleots, brigantines, and even river barges, created a tight net that prevented any supplies from reaching the city. The naval blockade was crucial to Ottoman strategy. Medieval sieges were won as much by starvation as by assault, and Belgrade's position at the confluence of two rivers meant that water transport was its most reliable supply line. By controlling the rivers, the Ottomans hoped to slowly strangle the city, even if their walls proved impregnable to cannon fire. On land, Mehmed's engineers began the systematic work of siege preparation. Ottoman military engineers were among the most skilled in the world, veterans of dozens of sieges who understood the complex mathematics of ballistics, fortification, and logistics. They began by digging the first parallel, a fortified trench line that allowed the army to approach the city walls while protected from defensive fire. This was hard, dangerous work, done mostly at night to avoid the garrison's crossbow bolts and small cannons. The siege lines were marvels of military engineering. The trenches were not simple ditches, but sophisticated earthworks, with firing steps, drainage systems, and protected communications trenches leading back to the main camp. Stakes and obstacles protected the front of the trenches, while carefully placed earth embankments provided additional protection for the soldiers. Meanwhile, the massive siege cannons were moved into position. This was an enormous undertaking that required hundreds of men and dozens of oxen. Each of the great cannons had to be precisely positioned and aimed, a process that involved complex calculations of trajectory, powder charges, and target selection. The cannon positions themselves were engineering marvels. Each great gun required a prepared foundation of stone and earth to absorb the massive recoil. Protective embankments shielded the crews from defensive fire, while carefully designed openings allowed the cannons to be aimed and fired. On July 4th, the bombardment began, and with it, Belgrade entered a new age of warfare. For weeks, a relentless thunder echoed across the plains as the giant cannons pounded the walls of Belgrade. These were the superweapons of their day, bronze monsters that represented the cutting edge of 15th century military technology. The largest cannons hurled massive stone balls weighing up to 1,200 pounds. These projectiles, carved from hard limestone and perfectly rounded by skilled stonemasons, could shatter through 6 feet of medieval masonry. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The sound of the great cannons firing was unlike anything most people had ever experienced. Contemporary accounts describe a noise like the voice of God in anger that could be heard for miles. The ground shook with each discharge, windows shattered in houses far from the walls, and many defenders were driven temporarily deaf. Between the cannon shots came the constant whistle of smaller projectiles. Stone balls from lighter cannons, iron bolts from giant crossbows, and arrows from thousands of Ottoman archers. The defenders could never rest, never feel safe anywhere within the walls. The defenders inside worked tirelessly, patching the damage at night with whatever they could find. This was desperate, dangerous work done under the cover of darkness, while Ottoman archers and crossbowmen tried to pick off anyone moving on the walls. The garrison used everything available for repairs: stones from ruined buildings, earth from gardens, even furniture and household goods to fill gaps in the walls. But it was a losing battle. The outer walls, built in an earlier era for an earlier type of warfare, were simply not designed to withstand the massive impact of Ottoman supercannons. Medieval fortifications relied on height and thickness, but against cannons that could punch through any masonry, these advantages became weaknesses. The outer walls started to crumble just as they had at Constantinople. Day by day, the massive stones were pulverized into rubble. Gaps appeared and widened despite the defenders' best efforts. The familiar sight of the white limestone walls gave way to piles of broken stone mixed with earth and debris from hasty repairs. The psychological pressure was immense. The defenders could see their protection disappearing piece by piece. Every man in the garrison knew the fate that awaited a city taken by storm. Massacre, slavery, and destruction were the usual consequences of resistance. Hunyadi knew he couldn't just wait for the walls to fall. His first critical goal was to break the naval blockade on the Danube. Without access to the city, he couldn't reinforce the garrison or provide the supplies necessary for a prolonged defense. The Ottoman fleet controlling the Danube was formidable, but not invulnerable. Mehmed's naval forces were designed primarily for river operations and coastal warfare. They were powerful, but not as maneuverable as smaller vessels designed specifically for river combat. Hunyadi had managed to assemble his own makeshift fleet from whatever vessels he could gather. Hungarian riverboats, captured Ottoman vessels from previous campaigns, and even civilian craft pressed into military service. These ships were smaller and lighter than the Ottoman vessels, but also faster and more familiar with the treacherous currents and hidden obstacles of the Danube. On July 14th, he launched a desperate, brilliant attack. The battle plan was risky, but showed Hunyadi's tactical genius. Instead of attempting to outfight the Ottoman fleet ship to ship, he would use speed and local knowledge to break through their line and scatter their formation. His fleet charged directly at the Ottoman blockade just as dawn was breaking. The timing was crucial. Early morning mist provided some concealment, but there was enough light for his pilots to navigate the dangerous river channels. The attack came as a complete surprise to the Ottoman commanders, who had grown complacent after weeks of unopposed control of the river. Hunyadi's ships, their crews screaming Hungarian war cries, crashed into the Ottoman line like a storm wind. In a brutal 5-hour battle, they shattered the Ottoman blockade. The fighting was chaotic and vicious. River combat left no room for sophisticated tactics, only courage and seamanship. Hungarian sailors boarded Ottoman vessels with swords and axes, while others used their knowledge of the river to ram enemy ships onto hidden sandbanks. The Ottomans fought back fiercely, but their larger vessels were at a disadvantage in the confined waters. Several of their largest galleys were sunk when Hungarian fire ships, small boats loaded with combustibles, crashed into them and set them ablaze. By afternoon, the river was open. The Ottoman fleet had been scattered, with dozens of smaller ships captured and several large vessels sunk or beached. The way to Belgrade was open, and Hunyadi could finally communicate with the garrison and provide them with reinforcements and supplies. Hunyadi rushed reinforcements and supplies to the exhausted garrison, a crucial early victory that boosted morale throughout the Christian camp. More importantly, it demonstrated that the supposedly invincible Ottoman war machine could be beaten with courage and intelligent tactics. But Mehmed was not deterred. The loss of his fleet was an annoyance, but not a decisive setback. His real power lay in his cannons and his janissaries. If anything, the naval defeat seemed to intensify his determination to take the city by force. The bombardment continued, growing even more intense. The Sultan ordered his gunners to maintain constant fire, with the great cannons working in rotation so that there was no respite for the defenders. The smaller cannons joined in, creating a continuous thunder that made communication impossible and sleep unthinkable. The technical challenges of maintaining this bombardment were enormous. Each shot required careful preparation. The cannon barrel had to be cleaned and inspected, the precise amount of gunpowder measured and loaded, and the stone ball carefully positioned. The great cannons generated enormous heat and had to be allowed to cool between shots to prevent the bronze from cracking. Ottoman engineers had brought enormous quantities of gunpowder in stone balls. The stone balls were works of art in themselves, carved by skilled masons to precise specifications. Too large and they wouldn't fit in the cannon bore. Too small and the explosive force would escape around them. Too rough and they would damage the cannon barrel. Too smooth and they might not fly true. The constant bombardment also required enormous logistical support. Gunpowder had to be kept dry and safe from sparks. Stone balls had to be transported from the supply trains to the cannon positions. Damaged cannons had to be repaired by skilled bronzesmiths who traveled with the army. Finally, after weeks of relentless pounding, the outer walls were breached in several places. The sight must have been heartbreaking for the defenders. Gaps in the once proud walls wide enough for dozens of men to pass through simultaneously. The city was exposed, and everyone knew what came next. On the evening of July 21st, Mehmed ordered the final, all-out assault. The Sultan himself took position where he could observe the attack, surrounded by his personal guard and the great standards of the empire. Under the cover of darkness, the elite janissaries flooded into the city through the rubble-filled breaches. This was the moment they had trained for their entire lives. The storm of a fortified city was the ultimate test of an infantry soldier's courage and skill. The janissaries advanced not as a mob, but as a disciplined military formation. Each orda company had its assigned breach or section of wall. Behind them came the regular infantry, ready to exploit any success. The attack was coordinated with precision that reflected decades of experience in siege warfare. They poured into the lower town, and fierce, desperate fighting broke out in the streets. The garrison, outnumbered and exhausted from weeks of bombardment, fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death or slavery. Street fighting in medieval cities was brutal and chaotic. Narrow alleys became death traps, and every house could become a fortress. The janissaries had trained for this kind of combat. They advanced methodically, using their superior discipline and equipment to overcome desperate resistance. Their curved swords were perfectly suited for close-quarters fighting, while their composite bows allowed them to engage enemies at longer range in the wider streets. The outnumbered defenders were pushed back, fighting for every inch of ground. Hungarian and Serbian soldiers, alongside the civilian population, turned every building into a strongpoint. Women and children threw stones and boiling water from windows, while craftsmen used their tools as weapons. Blacksmiths wielded hammers, carpenters fought with axes, and even priests abandoned their sacred duties to take up arms. The Ottomans pressed their attack with relentless pressure, moving toward the main fortress of the upper town. The sight of Ottoman soldiers in the streets of Belgrade sent shockwaves through both the garrison and the relief army camped outside the walls. It looked like the end had finally come. The psychological impact was devastating. If the elite Janissaries could break into the city, how long before the entire defense collapsed? A Turkish soldier even managed to plant the Sultan's standard on top of a bastion, the green banner with its Islamic crescents and Arabic calligraphy fluttering above the Christian fortress. This was more than symbolic. In Ottoman military tradition, planting the Sultan's standard signified that the city belonged to the empire. In the chaos of the all-night assault, with Janissaries swarming through the breaches and fighting raging in every street, John Hunyadi made a brilliant tactical move that demonstrated why he was considered one of Europe's greatest military minds. He had been watching the assault from his position outside the walls, coordinating with the garrison through messengers and signals. What he saw was both terrifying and promising. Terrifying because of the ferocity of the Ottoman attack. Promising because he could see weaknesses in their execution. Hunyadi ordered his men to collect oil-soaked wood and other flammable materials and throw them into the narrow streets where the Janissaries were advancing. This wasn't random destruction, but calculated tactical engineering. He had studied the layout of Belgrade's lower town and identified the key choke points where fire would be most effective. A wall of fire erupted in the narrow medieval streets, separating the thousands of Janissaries who had already broken through from the rest of the army trying to follow. The flames created an impassable barrier that split the Ottoman assault force in two. The elite troops who had successfully entered the city were now trapped, cut off from reinforcements, and forced into a bloody house-to-house fight with increasingly desperate defenders. Instead of a coordinated assault supported by reserves, the Janissaries found themselves isolated in a hostile city where every building could hide enemies. This tactical masterstroke transformed the nature of the battle. Ottoman military doctrine relied on coordinated attacks with mutual support between different units. By severing the connection between the assault troops and their supports, Hunyadi had turned the Ottoman strength, their disciplined coordination, into a weakness. The defenders fought with incredible ferocity that night, knowing that this was likely their final battle. Contemporary accounts, while sometimes embellished, capture something of the extraordinary courage displayed by ordinary people facing an existential threat. In a now famous legend of heroism, a Hungarian soldier named Titus Dugovic is said to have grabbed the Turk who planted the Sultan's flag on the rampart and pulled them both off the wall to their deaths, preventing the symbol of defeat from demoralizing the defenders. While the historical accuracy of this specific incident cannot be verified, it reflects the kind of sacrifice that ordinary soldiers were willing to make. The story became part of Hungarian folklore and represents the broader pattern of individual heroism that characterized the defense. Similar acts of courage occurred throughout the night. A Serbian archer named Stefan Lazarevic reportedly stayed at his post on a crumbling tower until it collapsed, continuing to shoot arrows at the attackers even as the masonry fell around him. A group of Hungarian craftsmen barricaded themselves in a warehouse and held off repeated Janissary attacks until dawn, using their tools and improvised weapons to deadly effect. The civilian population also played a crucial role. Women organized the care of wounded soldiers and the distribution of food and water. Children served as messengers, carrying communications through the maze of streets and buildings. Even elderly people contributed by providing intelligence about Ottoman movements and helping to coordinate the defense. The morning of July 22nd rose on a scene of carnage and exhaustion. The city had held, but just barely. Both sides had suffered enormous casualties, and it was clear that another assault might succeed where this one had failed. Bodies littered the streets where the fiercest fighting had occurred. The narrow medieval alleys were slippery with blood, and the acrid smell of smoke from Hunyadi's fires mixed with the stench of death. Many buildings had been damaged or destroyed in the fighting, and parts of the lower town lay in ruins, but the walls still flew Christian banners, and the Ottoman assault had been repulsed. More importantly, the psychological impact of the failed attack rippled through both armies. The defenders, who had expected to die, found new hope in their survival. The Ottomans, who had expected easy victory, began to doubt their invincibility. Hunyadi gave strict orders that would prove controversial but militarily sound. No one was to leave the fortress. They had to repair the walls and get ready for the next attack. This was the rational decision of a professional soldier. He knew his peasant army was no match for the Ottomans in an open field battle. Hunyadi's military experience told him that sieges were won by patience and preparation, not by dramatic gestures. The smart move was to use the respite to strengthen the defenses, tend to the wounded, and prepare for the inevitable next assault. He knew his peasant army, despite their courage and enthusiasm, lacked the training and equipment for open battle against professional Ottoman forces. The Janissaries had been repulsed once, but only because they had been isolated and fighting in confined spaces that negated their advantages in discipline and coordination. But what happened next wasn't part of any general's plan. It was a moment of spontaneous holy madness that would change the course of history. Despite Hunyadi's strict orders, some of Capistrano's crusaders positioned near the Ottoman lines started sneaking out to harass enemy soldiers. These weren't planned military operations, but individual acts of aggression, driven by religious fervor and battlefield excitement. The harassment began small, a few peasants with scythes attacking Ottoman soldiers who had wandered too far from their lines while gathering wood or water. These skirmishes were more like bandit attacks than military operations, but they had an effect on Ottoman morale. The Ottoman cavalry, professional soldiers trained in mounted warfare, tried to scatter these impromptu raiders. Under normal circumstances, heavy cavalry should have been able to disperse unarmored peasants without difficulty. But something extraordinary happened. The peasants, armed with their farm tools and burning with religious fire, refused to back down. This defiance was unprecedented in the Ottomans' experience. Peasant levies typically broke and ran when faced with heavy cavalry. These crusaders stood their ground, fighting with weapons they had used all their lives against enemies they saw as the embodiment of evil. Seeing their comrades in combat, more crusaders joined them, then more. The human psychology of crowd behavior took over. What started as isolated incidents became a contagious wave of aggression. The sight of their fellow crusaders fighting inspired others to abandon caution and join the battle. What started as a small skirmish quickly exploded into a full-scale, unauthorized charge. This wasn't military tactics, but mass psychology. The Crusader army was acting like a single organism, driven by shared emotion, rather than rational command decisions. John of Capistrano, seeing his flock charging straight into the teeth of the Ottoman army, at first tried to order them back. As a priest, he understood the value of human life and knew that this uncoordinated attack could result in massacre. But as he watched the scene unfold, something changed in the old friar's mind. Perhaps it was the sight of ordinary people willing to die for their faith. Perhaps it was a moment of divine inspiration. Or perhaps he simply recognized that the moment had taken on a life of its own, and that his choice was to lead or to watch his followers die without guidance. Seeing their unstoppable zeal, he had a change of heart. Instead of continuing to call them back, he made a decision that would echo through history. He ran to the front of the disorganized mob, held a large crucifix high in the air, the same crucifix that had accompanied him through years of preaching across Europe, and led them forward, his voice roaring above the din of battle. The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the end. This moment transformed a military disaster into something approaching the miraculous. The 70-year-old friar, who had spent his life in peaceful scholarship and preaching, became, in that instant, a war leader whose courage inspired thousands. His presence at the front of the charge had an electrifying effect on the Crusaders. This wasn't just their priest, but a representative of God himself, leading them into battle. The psychological impact was tremendous. Men who might have hesitated when faced with Ottoman steel found new courage in the sight of their spiritual leader sharing their danger. It was a suicidal charge, an act of pure, irrational faith, and it changed history. By every principle of military science, what happened next should have been a massacre. Unarmored peasants charging directly into professional soldiers should have resulted in complete slaughter. The Ottomans had every advantage: better weapons, superior armor, disciplined formations, and experienced leadership. But warfare, especially medieval warfare, was not purely a matter of equipment and training. Morale, surprise, and psychological factors could sometimes overcome material advantages. The Crusader charge succeeded not because it was militarily sound, but because it was completely unexpected and executed with such desperate courage that it disrupted Ottoman plans and formations. Watching from the fortress walls, Hunyadi was horrified. His entire strategy was coming apart before his eyes. Everything he had planned, the careful coordination, the defensive positions, the methodical preparation, was being abandoned for what looked like a suicide mission. The professional soldier in him wanted to maintain discipline and stick to the plan, but the experienced commander in him could see something else. The peasant charge was sowing confusion and panic in the Ottoman lines in a way that conventional tactics might not have achieved. As he watched the impossible scene unfold, he realized this was his one and only chance. The Ottomans were reacting to an unexpected threat. Their formations were disrupted, and their attention was focused on the wrong part of the battlefield. He couldn't let their sacrifice be for nothing. Making the decision of a lifetime, one that went against every instinct of his professional military training, he unleashed his own force. His elite heavy cavalry thundered out of the city in a perfectly timed, disciplined charge. This was military professionalism at its finest. The contrast with the chaotic peasant charge couldn't have been more stark, but the two attacks complemented each other perfectly. Hunyadi's knights were among the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They rode powerful war horses bred specifically for battle, wore the best armor Italian craftsmen could produce, and carried weapons forged by master smiths. More importantly, they had trained together for years and could coordinate their actions with the precision of a machine. The timing was crucial. Hunyadi launched his attack just as the Ottoman forces were trying to respond to the peasant charge. The Ottomans found themselves facing threats from two directions simultaneously, and their command structure couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing situation. The cavalry charge smashed into the Ottoman flank with devastating impact, driving straight for the one target that could win the battle: the Ottoman cannon positions. This wasn't random violence, but calculated military action aimed at neutralizing the enemy's most dangerous weapons. Capturing or destroying siege cannons had been a priority for defending armies throughout the medieval period, but it was exceptionally difficult to achieve. The cannons were usually well protected, heavily guarded, and positioned behind earthworks that made cavalry attacks nearly impossible. But the chaos created by the peasant charge had disrupted Ottoman defensive arrangements. Guards who should have been protecting the cannons were dealing with crusaders, and the carefully planned defensive positions were compromised by the unexpected direction of the attack. The Ottoman army, despite its professionalism and experience, was caught completely by surprise. The very strengths that usually made Ottoman forces so effective, their disciplined formations, coordinated tactics, and centralized command, became weaknesses when faced with such an unprecedented situation. In front of them was a screaming, unstoppable wave of peasants, led by a priest holding a crucifix. This wasn't in any military manual. How do you deploy professional soldiers against what appeared to be a religious mob that had no regard for military conventions? On their flank, they were being torn apart by some of the best heavy cavalry in Europe. Hunyadi's knights, taking advantage of the confusion, were systematically destroying the Ottoman army's most valuable assets. The psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman soldiers, who had been trained to expect certain types of battlefield behavior, found themselves facing enemies who didn't follow the rules. The sight of a 70-year-old priest leading a charge of peasants with farm tools challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. The Crusaders stormed the Ottoman camp with a fury that defied military explanation. These weren't professional soldiers executing a battle plan, but ordinary people fighting for everything they held sacred. Their attack had the wild energy of a religious riot, rather than a military operation. Hunyadi's knights, meanwhile, achieved their primary objective. They captured the massive siege cannons, the very weapons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople and dozens of other cities. In a stunning turn of events that must have seemed like divine intervention to the Christian forces, they turned the cannons on their former masters. The great bronze monsters that had been pounding Belgrade's walls were now firing into the heart of the Ottoman camp. The psychological impact was enormous. The Ottomans were being destroyed by their own superweapons, operated by the very people they had come to conquer. The cannons targeted the Sultan's own bodyguard, and the command centers where Ottoman officers were trying to coordinate a response to the crisis. The destruction was both physical and symbolic. The instruments of Ottoman technological superiority had become the means of their defeat. The invincible army collapsed into chaos as panic set in, and soldiers began to flee. The sight of their own cannons firing at them, combined with the inexplicable success of the peasant charge, shattered Ottoman morale. Even Sultan Mehmed II, fighting desperately to rally his men, was wounded in the thigh during the confusion. Various accounts differ on exactly how this happened. Some say he was struck by a crossbow bolt while trying to restore order. Others claim he was injured by debris from one of his own cannons. The wound itself was not life-threatening, but its psychological impact was enormous. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who was thought to be under divine protection, was bleeding like any mortal man. For soldiers who had been taught to see their leader as almost superhuman, The sight of his vulnerability was devastating. The conqueror, the man who had broken Constantinople and who seemed destined to march on Rome itself, was defeated by an army of peasants and a handful of knights. His carefully planned siege, his magnificent army, and his reputation for invincibility had all been shattered in a single afternoon. His army was routed in a way that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Professional soldiers who had never experienced defeat found themselves running from enemies they had dismissed as harmless. The panic spread through the ranks like wildfire, and soon the entire Ottoman force was streaming away from Belgrade in disorderly retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the shattered remains of the great army retreated in haste, leaving behind their camp, their powerful cannons, and their reputation for invincibility. The retreat was so precipitous that enormous quantities of supplies, weapons, and treasure were abandoned. The Sultan, upon regaining consciousness and learning the full scale of the disaster, was said to have been barely stopped from taking his own life. The depth of his despair reflected not just military defeat, but the collapse of his grand strategic vision. Belgrade was supposed to be a stepping stone to Vienna and Rome, not the graveyard of his ambitions. The victory at Belgrade was absolute, a military upset of incredible proportions that would be remembered for centuries. Modern military historians still struggle to explain exactly how such an unlikely combination of factors could have produced such a decisive result. But the victory came at a terrible price that overshadowed the celebration. In the aftermath of the siege, with thousands of bodies lying under the summer sun, and the camp's sanitary conditions already compromised by weeks of military occupation, plague broke out in the Hungarian camp. Medieval armies were always vulnerable to disease, but the combination of overcrowding, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and summer heat created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. The plague that struck was probably bubonic plague, the same disease that had devastated Europe during the Black Death. The disease would claim the lives of the battle's two greatest heroes, creating a bitter irony that the men who had saved Christian Europe would not live to see the peace they had won. John Hunyadi, the brilliant general who had engineered the defense and made the crucial decision to coordinate the peasant charge with his cavalry attack, died just 3 weeks after his triumph. He fell ill within days of the victory, and despite the best medical care available, succumbed to the plague on August 11, 1456. His death was mourned throughout Europe. Pope Calixtus III called him the athlete of Christ and ordered special masses in his honor. The Hungarian nobility, who had been so reluctant to support him during his lifetime, suddenly realized what they had lost. A few months later, John of Capistrano, the warrior priest whose faith had inspired an army and whose courage had turned the tide of battle, also died from plague. He passed away on October 23, 1456, in the town of Ilok, still organizing the defense of the Hungarian frontier. They were heroes who didn't live to see the long-term consequences of the peace they had won, but their legacy was secure. Within decades, both men would be recognized as saints by the Catholic Church, Hunyadi as a defender of Christendom, Capistrano as a martyr to faith. The incredible victory at Belgrade halted the Ottoman advance into Hungary for the next 70 years. This was more than just a tactical success. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in southeastern Europe and gave Christian kingdoms time to reorganize their defenses. The defeat forced the Ottoman Empire to completely reconsider its European strategy. Instead of the rapid conquest of Central Europe that Mehmed had envisioned, the Ottomans were forced to consolidate their existing territories and rebuild their military reputation. It stabilized the frontiers of Christendom at a crucial moment. Without the victory at Belgrade, Ottoman forces might have reached Vienna in the 1450s rather than the 1520s, potentially changing the entire course of European history. The Habsburg monarchy, which would become the backbone of resistance to Ottoman expansion, gained crucial decades to strengthen its position. The victory became a symbol of hope across the continent, proving that the conqueror was not invincible. This psychological impact was as important as the military consequences. Christian Europe learned that Ottoman forces could be defeated, that faith and courage could overcome professional military superiority.